4:51 a.m., Caldwell County, North Carolina. The loading dock of the Catawba Mountain Hosiery Mill went dark for 3 seconds, then flooded with white tactical light. 2 ATF agents took the hinges. 1 took the lock. The door came inward. 13 women had been inside that building for 67 days. What brought federal agents to a brick textile mill in the North Carolina foothills on a Tuesday morning in April 2026 was not a tip from inside the operation. It was not a wiretap or an informant. It was a number from an electric meter, one that didn't match the building it was attached to. The case would eventually span 3 federal agencies, 4 states, and a corporate paper trail that ran from a Caldwell County property deed to a Houston post office box. It would result in 4 federal indictments under a statute that carries a 20-year maximum, and it would end in a second-floor loft above a break room, a space with 1 water line, no exit hardware on the kitchen door, and 13 women who had not seen daylight in over 2 months. This is how it happened. The Catawba Mountain Hosiery Mill was built in 1947 on a county road outside Lenoir, North Carolina. 2 stories of load-bearing brick, 28,000 square feet. The kind of structure that outlasts the companies that fill it. It ran full production through the 1980s, contracted in the 90s, and changed hands twice before going to partial operation status in 2011. By 2019, it was listed for sale every year. Nobody bought it. The equipment was aging. The county assessed the property at under $900,000. Textile manufacturing in Caldwell County was not a growth sector. In November 2025, the mill sold. The buyer was a North Carolina registered holding company called Meridian Textile Partners, LLC. The principal of record was a man named Warren Cassiel, listed with an address in Houston, Texas. Cassiel had no prior history in textile manufacturing, no website, no LinkedIn, no corporate filings prior to September 2025. The transaction closed for $840,000 in cash. Caldwell County recorded the property as returned to productive use. 3 weeks after closing, the mill ran its first night shift. By early December 2025, Knit Socks of America order forms had appeared in county commerce records. 3 trucks per week left the loading dock between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. The mill looked, from the outside, like a struggling regional manufacturer that had found a buyer willing to gamble on it. The operation underneath was something else entirely. Every machine in the mill ran 22 hours a day. The 13 women working those machines had answered an online job posting in late October 2025. The listing promised hospitality work out of Charlotte, hotel staffing, event support, competitive hourly pay, housing included. A recruiter named only as Marcus picked them up in Greenville, South Carolina. He drove them north. They arrived at the mill after dark. Their identification documents were collected at the door. They were told this was standard for bonded labor arrangements. They were told they each carried a debt of $14,000, recruitment fee, transport, housing. Until that debt was cleared through their wages, they could not leave. The math, as structured, made the debt nearly impossible to clear. The upper floor of the mill, a loft above the break room, had been converted into a sleeping area. Hot water reached it on a single supply line. The kitchen had no exit hardware on the interior side of the door. There was no phone access. The loading dock was secured from the outside. The women ranged in age from 22 to 41. They were United States residents from 3 states: North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Several had been reported missing to local law enforcement within weeks of their disappearance, though those reports had not yet coalesced into a federal pattern. They had been there 67 days by the time ATF breached the loading dock. The case did not begin with any of the missing person reports. It began with a routine audit. In early March 2026, a Duke Energy field auditor named Raymond Holloway flagged an address in Caldwell County for anomalous power consumption. The Catawba Mountain Hosiery Mill had registered a 4-hour overnight spike beginning at approximately 2 a.m., a sustained draw consistent with full industrial production, followed by a second baseline through daytime hours that read like continuous residential occupancy on the upper floor. Holloway had audited textile facilities for 9 years. He knew what a single-shift mill looked like on a consumption graph. This wasn't it. The overnight spike suggested machinery running through the night. The daytime baseline suggested people living in the building around the clock. For a mill that had filed for limited night-run status with the county commerce office, the numbers didn't fit. He flagged it twice in 3 weeks. The second flag included a note: residential draw pattern, upper floor, inconsistent with registered operational status. That note went to Duke Energy's regulatory compliance desk. From there, through a liaison referral, it reached ATF's Charlotte field office. Not because of the women, but because of a separate inquiry. ATF had been running a quiet surveillance thread on Meridian Textile Partners LLC since January 2026. The holding company's principal, Warren Cassiel, had surfaced in a firearms tracing inquiry. A small cache of unregistered short-barrel rifles had been recovered from a vehicle stop in Burke County in late December 2025. One of the rifles traced back through a straw purchase to a buyer with documented connections to a holding company in Houston. The Houston company shared a registered agent with Meridian Textile Partners. That was the thread ATF was pulling when the Duke Energy flag arrived. I've read through the ATF surveillance logs from this period. What stands out is how close they came to treating the Duke Energy referral as secondary, a footnote to the firearms inquiry, rather than a primary lead. The agent who elevated it, a Charlotte-based ATF analyst named Priya Nair, noted in a memo dated March 18th that the power consumption pattern warranted a separate review track. She requested HHS-OIG involvement. That decision changed everything. The Office of Inspector General of the Department of Health and Human Services joined the inquiry in the third week of March 2026. Their mandate was not firearms. It was labor compliance, specifically payroll records, tax withholding, and federal employment filings. What they found at the Catawba Mountain Hosiery Mill was a zero. No Social Security numbers on file. No I-9 employment eligibility verifications. No federal payroll tax deposits since the mill had restarted operations. The mill was generating commercial invoices and shipping documented freight. The trucks leaving the loading dock were real. The Knit Socks of America purchase orders were real. But the people running the machines did not, on paper, exist. In place of payroll documentation, HHS-OIG analysts found a petty cash wire pattern originating from a Houston shell entity. The wires ran in increments of just under $10,000, a threshold amount. They went to a money services account registered to Marcus Devereaux, a 34-year-old Greenville, South Carolina resident with a prior state fraud conviction. Devereaux was the recruiter. The financial pattern was what investigators call a structuring indicator, amounts deliberately sized to avoid mandatory bank reporting triggers. It is a federal offense on its own, but in context, it was a map. The money was not wages, it was operational funding, transport, supplies, the maintenance of a captive workforce that cost less to run than a legitimate payroll. What's most surprising about this case isn't the sophistication of the financial structure, it's how ordinary the surface looked. A mill that was supposed to be running, order books that matched a real company, trucks that left on schedule. The entire operation was designed to be invisible from the road. The mistake was the electricity. Here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface. The power draw that flagged the audit was caused by the operation being too functional. If the foreman had run reduced overnight hours, varied the schedule, or staggered the machinery, the consumption graph would have looked like any struggling mill doing what it could with limited staffing. Instead, they ran the lines as hard as they could, around the clock, because that was how the debt math worked. Faster production meant faster debt repayment, meant more profit, before anything attracted attention. The greed created the anomaly. The anomaly created the audit. The audit created the case. By late March 2026, agents from ATF, HHS-OIG, and the Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division had assembled a working case file with 4 primary subjects: Warren Cassiel, the principal of record, 2 foremen identified as Dale Pruitt, age 44, and Ronnie Shea, age 31, both from Burke County, and Marcus Devereaux, the Greenville recruiter. The investigators faced a problem. They had financial anomalies, they had a non-compliant payroll record, they had a power consumption graph. What they did not have was direct confirmation of who was in that building and what conditions they were living under. Until they had that, any raid carried legal risk, specifically the risk of breaching a private commercial property based on an electrical audit and a structuring flag, only to find a legitimate, if non-compliant workforce that a defense attorney could characterize as merely underpaid. Before the decision was made to seek infrared surveillance, the investigative team had to account for every piece of documentation already in hand. Nair's case chronology from the last week of March 26 runs to 47 pages. It includes annotated billing records from the Knit Socks of America account, a side-by-side comparison of the mill's registered night shift schedule against the Duke Energy consumption timestamps, and a summary of the Burke County firearms recovery that had originally triggered the Meridian Textile surveillance thread. What the chronology makes plain, reading it now, is that each individual document was explainable in isolation. The firearms connection was one straw purchase removed from Cassiel. The structuring transfers were below the reporting threshold by design. The missing person reports from 3 states had not been formally cross-referenced because they originated in different jurisdictions with different filing systems. No single piece of paper was enough. The investigators knew that. So they built toward the one thing that could not be explained away: confirmed human presence in a building where, according to every document on file, no workers were supposed to be sleeping. ATF requested an infrared overpass of the property in late March. 2 aircraft passes over a 4-day window produced thermal imaging showing consistent human heat signatures in the upper floor of the mill between midnight and 6 a.m., the hours when the lower floor machinery would have been running. People were sleeping upstairs while machines ran downstairs. The upper floor occupancy was not a temporary worker dormitory. The signatures were present every night for the full 4-day observation window. The infrared imagery itself required careful handling. The legal standard for aerial thermal surveillance of a structure had been argued in federal courts since the early 1990s, and the investigators were precise about their methodology. Both passes were conducted from navigable airspace at altitudes that did not require a separate warrant under the applicable circuit precedent. The imaging was processed by a contracted analyst and delivered to the Charlotte field office sealed. When Nair reviewed the results, she cross-referenced the signature count against the missing person reports that HHS-OIG had pulled from the 3 state databases. 13 heat signatures on the upper floor on the night of March 29th. 13 women reported missing in the relevant window. The number matched. That evidence, combined with the financial documentation and the missing person reports that HHS-OIG had now pulled from 3 state law enforcement databases, was enough for a federal magistrate in the Western District of North Carolina. A search and seizure warrant was signed on April 11, 2026. Execution was scheduled for April 14th. Then, 72 hours before the operation was set to launch, a complication surfaced. ATF surveillance detected what appeared to be an anomaly in truck scheduling. On the night of April 11th, 2 trucks left the loading dock at an unusual time, mid-afternoon, not the overnight window. Analysts flagged this as a possible sign that someone inside or adjacent to the operation had been tipped that law enforcement was circling. If the subjects were moving product, or worse, moving people, the window would close. An emergency operational review was called at the Charlotte field office on the morning of April 12th. The option of accelerating the raid to April 12th or 13th was considered and rejected. The tactical element was not in position. A rushed entry with incomplete preparation risked both agent safety and the integrity of the forensic seizure. Analyst Nair argued that the truck movement was more likely a routine schedule adjustment than a tip response. There had been no detectable change in the upper floor heat signatures, which meant the women were still there. The decision was made to hold the April 14th date. Put yourself in that room for a moment. The warrant is signed. You have confirmation that the people you are trying to reach are still in the building, and you are choosing to wait 48 more hours because rushing would compromise the case and endanger the people you are trying to protect. Every investigative instinct says go. Operational discipline says hold. They held. In the 36 hours between the April 12th operational review and the pre-dawn launch on April 14th, the tactical and forensic teams completed their site preparation in parallel. The ATF tactical element ran 2 dry rehearsals of the loading dock breach at a comparable industrial structure in Lincoln County, approximately 40 miles south of the target property. The rehearsals focused on 2 variables: the time required to clear the ground floor production area without disturbing evidence in place, and the coordination window between the loading dock entry and the second floor loft breach. The interval between those 2 actions had to be tight enough that a foreman on the ground floor could not warn anyone upstairs before the HHS-OIG element reached the loft stairwell. Investigators determined that 11 minutes was the outer limit. They planned for 8. The forensic team prepared separate evidence collection protocols for 4 distinct zones: the production floor, the floor supervisor's station, the upper floor loft, and the mill's administrative office on the ground floor eastern wing, where financial records were expected to be stored. Each zone had a designated lead agent and a chain of custody kit. The forensic team lead, an HHS-OIG senior investigator named Dana Corrigan, had prepared a priority item list based on the structuring analysis: physical ledgers, any mobile devices, cash on hand, and documentation of the debt-bondage accounting system. If that system existed in physical form, if the foreman had kept written records of the $14,000 debts attributed to each woman, those documents would become the core of the forced labor counts in the eventual indictment. The night of April 13th, surveillance confirmed the normal overnight truck departure at approximately 11:40 p.m. The upper floor heat signatures were consistent with prior observations. The 2 foremen appeared to be on site. There was no indication of elevated activity. The tactical element moved to the rally point at 4:22 a.m., April 14, 2026. 4:51 a.m., an ATF tactical element approached the loading dock from the southern access road, using a construction equipment staging area on the adjacent parcel as a vehicle rally point. A parallel HHS-OIG forensic team held at the northern perimeter, assigned to the second-floor loft access stairwell. A 3rd element from the Department of Labor was staged at the county road to intercept any outbound vehicle. The loading dock door came down at 4:51 a.m. The ATF element cleared the ground floor production area in 4 minutes. No resistance. Dale Pruitt was located near the floor supervisor's station. Ronnie Shea was found in a vehicle in the parking area on the western side of the building. At 5:02 a.m., HHS-OIG agents breached the second-floor loft, 11 minutes from initial entry. The forensic team's incident report describes what they found in clinical language: conditions consistent with prolonged confinement, personal effects limited to what could be carried in a single bag. The kitchen door had no interior release hardware. 3 of the 13 women required immediate assistance walking to the transport vehicles. What the incident report doesn't describe is the texture of those 11 minutes. The loft stairwell was narrow, unlit at the top, and accessed through a fire door that opened inward. The HHS-OIG element made entry without announcement, per the warrant authorization, and used handheld lights to navigate the space before activating the overhead fluorescents. The room they entered ran the full width of the building above the break room, approximately 40 feet by 30 feet, with a low ceiling and exposed ductwork. There were cots arranged in 2 rows. There was a shared bathroom visible through an open door on the far wall. A portable electric burner sat on a folding table near the kitchen access point, which is the door with no interior release hardware. Several of the women were awake when the agents entered. The reports note this without elaboration. Agent statements describe a space orderly in a way that suggested sustained habitation rather than temporary use. Grim domesticity had developed over 67 days because people adapt to the conditions in front of them when there is no alternative. Among the items collected from the loft during the forensic sweep, a handwritten notebook, later identified as a communal record kept by two of the women, documenting dates, names, and what the authors described as shift hours and debt calculations. The women had been tracking their own accounts. They knew the numbers didn't work. They had written it down anyway. All 13 were transported to Valdez Family Medical Center in Burke County. Clinical examinations were conducted. The examining physician's documentation, submitted as federal evidence, confirmed conditions consistent with extended confinement and restricted access to routine medical care. Several of the women had been reported missing by family members between 40 and 60 days prior to the rescue. Someone had been waiting for each of them. The public record does not release the names of the 13 women. The indictment and case filings treat them as a collective. 13 victims, 13 heat signatures, 13 sets of conditions consistent with prolonged confinement. But the missing person reports that HHS-OIG cross-referenced, combined with victim witness coordinator notifications from April 14th, sketch the outlines of lives the job posting interrupted. The youngest was 22 years old. She had been enrolled part-time at a community college in Gaston County and was working a hospitality job at a hotel near the interstate when she responded to the listing. Her mother had filed a missing person report with the Gaston County Sheriff's Office 23 days after her disappearance. The report was in the system. It had not connected to anything else until HHS-OIG ran the cross-reference in late March 2026. The oldest was 41. She was from the Savannah area, technically Georgia, which is how the case file lists her, and had been looking for domestic staffing work after the hotel, where she'd been employed for 6 years, reduced its hours. She had 2 children. Her sister had contacted the Georgia Bureau of Investigation and been told that adult missing person cases involving individuals with no criminal history and no evidence of foul play were classified as voluntary disappearances without evidence to the contrary. The sister had not accepted that classification. She had kept calling. At least 4 of the 13 women had reached out to someone in the days after they arrived at the mill, before phone access was removed. A family member, a friend, a coworker. Those contacts had not known what to do with what they were told. In 2 cases, the contact had called a local law enforcement non-emergency line and described the situation secondhand. Those calls were logged. They did not generate follow-up investigations. This is the gap the case exposes at the individual level. The structural gap, between agencies watching different things, is documented in the case chronology. The personal gap is documented in those phone logs and missing person reports. People were trying to report what was happening. The signals existed, they did not connect. The handwritten notebook recovered from the loft was entered into evidence as Exhibit 44. It is not publicly available. The case filings describe it as a contemporaneous record in 2 distinct handwriting styles, covering entries from December 2025 through early April 2026. It documents shift lengths, production quotas, and what the authors called the number, their term for the running total of their individual debts, as calculated by the foreman. The entries stop on April 8th, 6 days before the breach. The last entry reads, "In full, as transcribed in a case filing footnote, number went up again. Don't know why. Writing this down so someone knows. Someone does know. That notebook is federal evidence now." Warren Cassiel was arrested in Houston, Texas, at 6:14 a.m. on April 14th, 23 minutes after the loading dock breach in Caldwell County. A coordinated apprehension team from HSI Houston executed the arrest at his registered address. He was found at the property. He had not received warning. Marcus Devereaux was arrested in Greenville at 6:51 a.m. All 4 subjects were in federal custody before 8 a.m. on April 14th. The processing of evidence from the mill's administrative office took 11 days. Dana Corrigan's forensic team worked through the material in sequence, prioritizing documents that could establish the knowledge element of the forced labor charges. Specifically, evidence that Cassiel, Pruitt, and Shea had designed the debt structure to prevent departure rather than simply failing to comply with wage and hour law. The distinction matters enormously in federal prosecution. Underpayment is a civil matter. A debt designed to function as a lock is forced labor. What the administrative office yielded was cleaner than expected. There were printed spreadsheets, stored in a locked file cabinet in the Eastern Wing office, that listed each woman by a number rather than a name. Each row showed an initial debt figure of $14,000, a column for weekly production credits, and a column for weekly deductions, housing, meals, supplies. These consistently exceeded the production credits by a margin of between 12 and 40% depending on the week. The math was explicit. The debts were not decreasing. Several had increased over the operational period. One spreadsheet carried a handwritten annotation in the margin of the final column. "Keep the number moving." That annotation was attributed to Pruitt through handwriting analysis. It appears in the indictment. The administrative office also contained a folder of printed email correspondence between Cassiel and a Houston-based logistics contact regarding the Knit Socks of America fulfillment schedule. The correspondence was businesslike and made no reference to labor conditions. What it did establish was that Cassiel was directly managing the production timeline. The pressure to run 22-hour days was coming from the top of the structure, not from the foremen acting on their own initiative. The emails became the basis for the conspiracy count in the indictment. Cassiel directed production. Pruitt and Shea enforced it. Devereaux supplied the workforce. Each element of the forced labor statute was covered by a different defendant. On May 6, 2026, a federal grand jury in the Western District of North Carolina returned indictments against all four subjects under 18 United States Code, Section 1589, forced labor. The statute carries a maximum sentence of 20 years. The indictment also included conspiracy charges and financial crimes related to the structuring pattern identified by HHS-OIG. The mill was sealed under a federal civil asset forfeiture hold, pending proceedings. Here's what this case tells us about how these operations survive as long as they do. They exploit the gap between agencies that watch different things. ATF watches firearms. HHS-OIG watches payroll compliance. Duke Energy watches electricity consumption. None of those agencies, in isolation, had enough to move. It was the intersection that built the case. The analyst who connected a power flag to a firearms inquiry to a labor compliance gap. Without Priya Nair's decision to treat a utility referral as a separate investigative track, this case very possibly does not close in April 2026. It closes, if at all, years later and under different circumstances. The question worth asking, one the case files don't fully answer, is how many similar operations never reach that intersection? How many utility anomalies go unconnected to a separate agency's thread because no one person decides to elevate the referral? There's a line in the indictment that reads almost like something else. Footnote 7 of the financial crimes count describes the structuring pattern as a series of transfers designed to avoid detection by any single regulatory system. The indictment is correct. The system was designed to be invisible to each agency individually. The only thing that made it visible was 3 agencies looking at the same address at the same time. The 4 defendants are currently awaiting trial. Cassiel's defense has entered a not guilty plea. Devereaux has retained separate counsel. No trial date has been set as of late June 2026. In the weeks following the indictments, federal investigators conducted 2 formal interviews with Dale Pruitt under a proffer agreement negotiated by his defense counsel. Pruitt was the floor supervisor, the person physically present in the mill during production hours, the person whose handwriting appeared on the spreadsheet annotation. He was also, the investigators noted, the defendant with the least apparent financial stake in the enterprise. The spreadsheets from the administrative office did not show payments to Pruitt beyond a flat weekly amount that HHS-OIG calculated as roughly consistent with a supervisory wage for legitimate industrial work. His apparent take from the operation was not substantially different from what a mill foreman earns legally. The proffer interviews are sealed. Their existence is referenced in a case management filing dated May 22nd. What that filing does disclose is that Pruitt provided information about the operational structure that investigators characterized as materially useful to at least one ongoing aspect of the inquiry. It is not specified which aspect. Ronnie Shea, who was arrested in the parking lot at 4:57 a.m. on April 14th, declined to cooperate. His attorney filed a motion challenging the circumstances of the vehicle search in mid-May. That motion is pending. The Knit Socks of America order books have been turned over to federal investigators to determine whether any counterparties had knowledge of the labor conditions at the mill. That review is ongoing. The Knit Socks of America inquiry warrants a closer look than the case filings give it. The company is a legitimate mid-size hosiery distributor based in the Charlotte metropolitan area. Its purchase orders for the Catawba Mountain Hosiery Mill products were reviewed by the Department of Labor as part of the supply chain audit that accompanied the indictments. The audit focused on a narrow question: did any purchasing agent or executive at Knit Socks of America have reason to know or suspect that the goods they were buying were produced under forced labor conditions? The audit is ongoing and has not produced public findings, but it raised a question that sits at the edge of this case and does not resolve neatly. The mill was producing legitimate goods. They went to a legitimate company. They entered a legitimate supply chain. The product itself carries no record of how it was made. Here is the piece of this that doesn't close cleanly. The online job postings that recruited the 13 women were hosted on at least 3 separate platforms. Those listings were taken down within 48 hours of the April 14th arrests. Someone connected to the operation had monitoring access to those platforms and removed the postings before law enforcement formally requested their preservation. Platform preservation requests went out on April 14th. 2 of the 3 platforms confirmed the postings had already been deleted. Who deleted them? It was not Cassiel. He was in custody. It was not Devereaux. He was in custody. It was not Pruitt or Shea. Federal investigators have identified a 5th individual referred to in public case filings only as an unindicted co-conspirator. This person is believed to have managed the digital recruitment infrastructure and, as of the date of this account, has not been located. The recruiter is named. The foremen are named. The principal is named. The person who built the front end of the operation, the postings that brought the women to the mill, remains at large. There is also the matter of the Houston shell entity. The petty cash wire pattern that HHS-OIG identified ran through a money services account registered to Devereaux, but the source account was a Houston-based LLC that has since been dissolved. The funds that passed through that account, approximately $160,000 in total, transfers over the operational period, have not been fully traced. Some portion appears to have moved to a third-party account in another state before the source entity was dissolved. That account has not been identified. $160,000 is not a large number in federal financial crime terms, but it represents 6 months of operational funding for an enterprise that held 13 women for 67 days and generated commercial revenue from their labor. It also represents a financial trail that, if followed to its end, may connect to a network beyond Caldwell County. Investigators have not publicly confirmed whether Meridian Textile Partners LLC was a standalone operation or one node in a larger structure. The case filings reference the holding company's prior registration in September 2025, 2 months before the mill purchase, but provide no detail on whether similar entities were registered in other states around the same time. What the financial analysts at HHS-OIG have noted, in internal case summaries not yet made public, is that the registration sequence, corporate entity formed, registered agent established, target property acquired, operational infrastructure deployed, follows a timeline that is compressed but not improvised. The gap between Meridian Textile Partners' initial registration in September 2025 and the first night shift at the mill in late November 2025 is less than 10 weeks. For a genuine startup textile operation, that timeline would be nearly impossible. Equipment inspection, regulatory filings, insurance underwriting, order book development, none of that happens in 10 weeks for a legitimate mill restart. It happened here because the infrastructure was pre-planned and the workforce was not being hired through any process that required time. The implication that investigators have declined to state on the record is straightforward. Whoever designed the operational template did not design it specifically for the Catawba Mountain Hosiery Mill. They designed a template. The mill was where they deployed it. The Catawba Mountain Hosiery Mill was sealed on April 14th. As of late June 2026, it remains sealed pending forfeiture proceedings. The brick structure built in 1947 is still standing. The equipment is still inside. The 13 women were transported to Valdez Family Medical Center before sunrise on April 14th. Their names are protected under federal victim privacy provisions and have not been released. Their families were notified by federal victim witness coordinators beginning at 8 a.m. on April 14th. What happened to those women in 67 days is documented in sealed federal evidence files. It is not described in public filings. The clinical reports from Valdez Family Medical Center are part of the evidentiary record for trial. They have not been released. The case against all 4 defendants remains active. A 5th individual remains unlocated. Think about that for a moment. The entire visible structure of the operation is dismantled. The building is sealed. The orders have stopped. The trucks no longer leave the loading dock at 3 a.m. And the person who ran the recruitment, who built the job listings, who put the women in contact with Marcus Devereaux, who deleted the postings within 48 hours of the arrests, is somewhere outside the reach of these proceedings. Will that individual resurface in another filing, under a different entity, in a different state? The case record points both ways. There's no clear answer. The operation required a recruiter who knew how to post convincing job listings. It required a holding company structure that passed county registration. It required a physical facility that looked functional from outside. It required an accountant-level understanding of structuring thresholds to avoid triggering bank reports. These are not skills that disappear when 4 defendants are indicted. Raymond Holloway, the Duke Energy auditor who flagged the address twice in 3 weeks, does not appear in any of the federal case filings as a witness or a named party. His role is documented in internal case chronologies as an originating referral. Under federal statute, utility auditors have no formal status in criminal proceedings. He flagged an anomaly. He passed it to a compliance desk. He went on to the next address on his audit list. 1 power consumption graph. 2 flags in 3 weeks. 67 days ended at 4:51 a.m. on April 14, 2026. The 5th individual is still unaccounted for. The recruitment infrastructure still exists somewhere in the form of knowledge, contacts, and methods that were not seized when the loading dock door came down. The mill is sealed. The demand that built it has not been.